Welcome to Strip Cover Lit, where we squeeze the bigger picture out of literature. I'm Adrian Fort, and we are here for day 6 of the 12 Days of Litmus. This day being my story with literature. I feel like I mess up the intro every day on this. So, where do I come to literature from? I have always been a writer, as long as I can remember. I would draw pictures when I was really young, too young to know the language, and I would explain what these pictures were to my little sister, who is still an excruciatingly kind and patient individual. But being a writer and being a reader are separate entities, in the same way that stories and literature are separate. And I think that the difference between stories and literature depends on the introspective nature being wrenched out of the audience, whether they are sentient of it or not, by literature, versus stories, which one can consume passively. An easier way to really sort of see this is with movies. The difference between being a movie critic and being someone who just passively watches movies in the theater and enjoys them or not, right? So when you criticize the movie, you are looking towards the introspection caused by that event. For me, the awakening to literature versus stories happened much later. I don't remember the inciting text, or the source material, but I had always been a comic book fan and thought that Superman was really sort of boring because, well, let's be honest, Superman's really sort of boring. But the comparison between Moses' parents and Superman's parents, setting them off as a toddler to then become a savior someplace else, was made, and everything got so much more interesting in a flash, pun intended, flash forward. And I graduated high school and went to a community college as I could afford it. I sort of bit and pieced that part of my education together. And I worked retail to do so, and retail, if you've never worked retail, really just sort of suppresses analytical thought and smashes any true kind of creativity. And after about 5 years, I had earned a 2-year degree, an associate's degree, and there was no way I was going to fit university into the life that I had created at that point. So, at 23, and finally able to sort of afford my place in the world, I was able to live a life that was not excessive, but I was able to afford everything I needed, finally. I was not having to scrounge around and live off ramen noodles. But I knew that I had to change everything, so I gave up a decent-ish job and the promise of a promotion to assume debt and a lot of unknown, because I knew I loved reading and I knew I loved writing, and I wanted to incorporate those into my life in a larger way. I wanted to actually take the time to learn something about them. I am not sure what a community college degree is like where you are, but there were no real literature courses at my community college. There were English classes where you would sort of kind of learn to write a paper, but there was nothing, there were no classes, at least that I was exposed to or that I knew of, by which you broke down literature to get the bigger picture out of it. Flash forward again, I had moved off to college, I had made that jump, and I was sitting on a bench outside my first live fire literature course. Sitting there outside the class before we got started, and it was one of those days where everything sort of hit me. I had already, for that class, failed to read Portrait of an Artist as a Young Man by Joyce. Wallace Stevens meant absolutely nothing to me, and I couldn't even understand the sentences in As I Lay Dying, let alone was I going to be able to write a 4-page essay on how that novel incorporates feminism or fails to incorporate feminism. Worse, possibly, than all of that, especially as I had given up the opportunity at a promotion to go off to college, was the fact that by some quirk of the literary god of irony, this course was forced not to meet in the English building, but instead we had to meet in the business building. So there I sat, sure that I was destined to be a college dropout, looking at turds wearing watches and button-ups with ties on, reading the New York Times, and shaking each other's hands, addressing each other by first and last name, for no reason. Not that I have anything against people who get business degrees, but that's what was going on. And what was harder for me to deal with was the fact that I knew that these people were going to get useful business degrees, and one of them would probably be my boss for the rest of my miserable life. This is known as the low point. It follows the falling action. However, that very semester ended in that class with discussing the poetry of Langston Hughes, and I was able to participate in those discussions. So it sort of reeled me back in to some sense of, I wouldn't call it complacency, because it was a little more charged than that, but it was a feeling almost of comfort. And that motivated me, as that was a semester before the summer, to try to read As I Lay Dying again. And I gave it a go, and I failed. But I've always considered myself someone of average intelligence, dastardly good looks, and a fierce work ethic. So I kept working. I kept reading that entire summer. I went back over a lot of the things that we had read in those classes, and I didn't get. And I just sort of tried to squeeze a little bit more out of them. And it allowed me, by working tirelessly through that summer, to sort of understand a few more of the bits and pieces and concepts and ideas that we were talking about in the classes. However, I was still, at that time, an English education major. Until I'm sitting in a class one day about teaching English, and I'm listening to people, extracurricular to the class discussion, debate whether or not there's literary merit in curse words. And I realized I did not belong there. These were classes that were not for me. This was being surrounded by people that I was so much different than. And I think that sometimes I've never been one to judge myself by a crowd or the company that I'm keeping. But the difference between me and every other individual in that class was so great that it was almost mortifying. So I gave up on the idea of ever having a stable job and converted to being a lit major, and have been unhappily satisfied ever since. The tools that I gained from being a lit major make my free time more satisfying than most of the people I know who earn more money than I do, but whose minds are not trained to play with ideas or concepts. So I am able to sort of pacify my mind during my free time, whereas other people just go out and get themselves into trouble. So that is sort of my story with literature overall, and how I got to be the hermit that you know today. And I don't know where to sum this up or to end this, because I don't think that this type of life ever has a conclusion. This is a type of life, this is the life of a student. Being a literature lover is the life of being a perpetual student, something that I had trained myself well for, taking 5 years to get a 2-year degree, and then reclassifying from being an English education major to an English lit major, which turned the last 2 years of my education into 4 years of education. So, now thankfully once I got to grad school, a 2-year program that most programs are, only took a year and change, so I was able to make up a little bit of ground during that time. But I think that the love of literature is the love of learning, is the love of constant change. And in that way, perhaps it is fitting to have a crappy end to a video explaining your story with literature. Maybe that is a literary moment. A little bit of irony. I'm going to stop now. Like and subscribe.